each of which you can take out of here today for free. Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Joseph Bast.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. So back in the day, Diane and I used to edit the Sierra Club's newsletter for Illinois. And that would have been in the early 1980s. And by coincidence, perhaps, that was the time in which the Sierra Club was making a big move into politics and away from organizing outings and picking up litter and restoring riverbanks and all the things that all of us who were members of the Sierra Club at the time really enjoyed doing. So Diane and I were editing this newsletter, and they kept telling us to put political stories on the front cover. And we said, why would we do that? I mean, some of us are Democrats, some are Republicans, some of us are even libertarians. Why put politics in here? And we were told in no uncertain terms, that's now the new rules. That's coming from Washington, D.C. Purpose of the newsletter is to organize political influence in the environmental debate. And so we got kicked out of the Sierra Club. So thank you very much for being here. As Jim said, my name is Joe Bast. I'm the president of the Heartland Institute. I had the privilege of helping to edit the book that I'm going to be discussing and working with some really talented guys. I'm going to briefly describe those authors to you. I'm going to prove that there is no consensus about global warming, this myth that there's a 97% consensus. I'm going to take that apart piece by piece and leave it on the floor, and you're all going to say, you're right, it's dead. There's nothing there. And then I'm going to explain why there's no consensus, why scientists disagree about global warming. And by the end of that conversation, I think you're all going to be very well equipped, as Jim Lakely said, to debate anybody on this topic. You will know more about it than virtually anyone who tries to talk to you about it. So this is the book, Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming, the NIPSI report on scientific consensus. Jim gave you a brief description of the Heartland Institute. You might ask, why would a free market think tank get involved in the global warming issue? It's because we saw the science being hijacked by groups on the left, exactly what I saw taking place at the Sierra Club. But other think tanks like the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, AEI, all these very good think tanks said, well, we don't do physical science. We do economics or political science or law. We don't do hard science. So we don't really want to get into that debate. And I felt that was a strategic error. I thought it was really important that somebody come in and confront the left on science. And that's why we got The Economist says that the Heartland Institute is the world's most prominent think tank on man-made climate change. New York Times says we're the primary American organization pushing climate change skepticism. Just earlier this year, an academic journal, the Global Environmental Change, did an article that said we are a central actor among conservative think tanks, producing or disseminating a significant portion of the documents of the corpus. Don't you love the way academics write of the corpus? In fact, we produce 39% of all the printed material that is skeptical of global warming, according to that particular report. So we've gotten some attention from the other side. This book has three authors. The first is Craig Idso, Dr. Craig Idso. He's a climatologist, one of the world's leading experts on the effects of carbon dioxide on plant and animal life. He's chairman of the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change. A second author is Dr. Robert M. Carter. Dr. Carter was a world-renowned paleogeologist, an emeritus fellow with the Institute for Public Affairs, author of a really good book titled Climate Change, the Counter-Consensus. Shockingly, Dr. Carter passed away in January, massive heart attack, and we were just all shocked by it. He was right in the middle of working on the final volume of Climate Change Reconsidered when that happened, literally just a few weeks after this book was released. So we lost Bob Carter. He was a very good guy and a good friend. And the third author is Dr. Fred Singer. He is the dean of physicists around the world. for 20, I believe it was 25 years. He was professor of environmental science at the University of Virginia. Before that, he held a number of positions in the U.S. government. He was one of the original rocket scientists in the United States. He had his face on the front of Time magazine. Just a tremendous guy. He founded the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, or NIPSI. One reason you may not hear more about him is because he came out against global warming alarmism. And the moment he did that, he started to get attacked, demonized, ostracized, and silenced. And so one of the world's most respected scientists, if you go to his Wikipedia page, is just full of just terrible accusations and negative stuff. Leaves out his biography of hundreds and hundreds of peer-reviewed scientific articles. So Fred Singer is one of the three authors, co-authors of this thing. Fred founded NIPSI, the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, in Milan, Italy in 2003. As its name suggests, it's an international panel of non-government scientists and scholars. None of these guys are paid by the government to hold an opinion one way or another on the climate change issue. It's now a joint project of three organizations: Fred's Science and Environmental Policy Project, the Heartland Institute, and Craig Idsow's Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change. NIPSI has produced a series of publications so far. This is a list of them. Why Scientists Disagree About Global Warming is the most recent one. The main finding of this book can be summarized in a single sentence, and it's on the screen here. The most important fact about climate science, often overlooked, is that scientists disagree about the environmental impacts of the combustion of fossil fuels on global climate. They disagree. There's fundamental disagreement. There's extensive debate inside the scientific community and in the peer-reviewed journals that shows this uncertainty and this constant learning process. Now, the other side knows this. The people who are out there saying it's a crisis, we got to do something about it, they're aware of this. They're aware of it because it was easy for us to find it. Literally thousands of peer-reviewed articles are just shouting out that we don't know for sure what's going on with the climate. There's fundamental risks. The models don't work. We'll get into some detail on some of that. But they hide it. And they hide it because they know that if the public is told that there's still debate and uncertainty on this, public support for their agenda just evaporates. Focus group meetings show that all the time. We see the same focus group results that the other side looks at. And anytime you say, well, some scientists disagree, boom, half of the people in the room say, oh, wait a minute. You know, this isn't gospel truth. This isn't religion. So that's why they hide it. Good example, on the website of NASA, you have this sentence: multiple studies published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, footnote 1, show that 97% or more of actively publishing climate scientists agree climate warming trends over the past century are very likely due to human activities, quote unquote. Now, look at footnote number 1. What does it say? It has 4 sources. And I'm going to go through each of those 4 sources. Footnote number 1 refers to 4 studies. The first one is by a socialist historian. The next 2 are by college students. They were literally college papers. Astonishing that they would cite this as proof. And the 4th study is by a wacky Australian blogger, who I'm going to describe to you in a little bit of detail. None of these are credible sources, okay? Not even close to being credible sources. So here's the socialist historian, Naomi Oreskes, 2004, University of California, San Diego. Those of you who follow the political correctness debate, they are way out to the left. There are no Republicans on the faculty at the University of California, San Diego. When we sent a book to some of the professors there, they posted a picture of somebody trying to light the book on fire. They literally posted that on Facebook. No tolerance of anything that's to the right of Mao and some of their favorite guys. So what did she claim to find? She said that she examined 928 abstracts from scientific papers that were published from 1993 to 2003. She concluded that 75% of the abstracts, either implicitly or explicitly, supported the IPCC's views, That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has only 2 C's, not 3, so there's a typo on the screen. I'm sorry about that. Support that view that human activities are responsible for most of the observed warming over the previous 50 years. So what's wrong with her study? Well, first of all, get this to work. It's not peer-reviewed. You might remember NASA says published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. Well, not all articles that appear in peer-reviewed scientific journals are peer-reviewed. Peer-reviewed journals have op-ed pieces and editorials that don't go through peer review. Turns out Naomi Oreskes' piece was an op-ed piece. It's 1 page long. It was 1 page long. It wasn't peer-reviewed. So even though it appeared in a peer-reviewed journal, it's not a peer-reviewed article. She searched for global climate change instead of climate change. Now, you might think that's kind of an arcane distinction. Well, actually, it leaves out 92% of all the articles about global warming. And when you look at the larger corpus of publications, you're going to find that many more of them express doubt and uncertainty and don't point to a human impact on climate. She's not a scientist, so she misrepresented or misunderstood many of the articles that she was looking at. You got to be a scientist to know if this article actually is making the point that you think it is. Another problem, she only looks at the abstracts. 2-paragraph or 1-paragraph summary of this entire article. Now, it's interesting. There's a whole literature. I wasn't aware of this until about 2 years ago. When scientists, when any academic writes an article, he or she has to write the abstract. They write them with lots of keywords in them so that they get picked by Google Scholar and other search engines. So you put global warming into your abstract, even if your article isn't about global warming or it just mentions it in passing. So your article is about the reproduction of frogs in the tropics, okay? So you put global warming in there because, maybe global warming might affect the temperature, which might affect the frogs. And sure enough, there's a sentence in your article that says that, but that's not what your article proves. There's no implicit endorsement of the IPCC's reports when you just mention that in passing in your article. There's lots of that. So abstracts do not accurately reflect the content of the articles. Any study that claims to find consensus by counting abstracts, you got to call BS on that. It's not the case. It's not a good methodology. She never explained how many of the articles actually address whether human activity is responsible for climate change. The issue here is causation, right? They call it attribution. Can we attribute an impact on climate to human activity? How many of the studies that she looked at, that she counts up here, even ask that question? Very, very few. 90% of them assume that it's the case. Or say, if it's the case, then frog reproduction in the tropics will go down. That's what the study is about. It's about frog reproduction. It's not about whether there's a human impact on climate. And yet those studies get rolled in here to say that it implicitly endorses the IPCC's findings. She never explains how many of these articles agree with the IPCC's definition of climate change, that more than half of the warming in the 20th century was caused by human activity. That's the real definition. And she made no effort to try to distinguish articles that found some impact from those that found lots, and whether or not it actually agreed with the IPCC. Okay, so anybody who says that that this is evidence that specifically supports the IPCC, they're wrong. They misunderstand what she actually found. Her findings were never replicated. I'm going to mention to you in a minute, somebody tried to replicate it, came up with entirely different results. Okay, if you can't replicate it, it's not science. A study aimed at updating the findings moving forward to a new database of more recent articles found that only 7% of recent articles actually support the alleged consensus. So dramatically different from what she found. And one reason for that is they searched for global or climate change, not global climate change. So the larger database does not show the consensus that she claims. All right, look at the second study. University of Illinois college student, Maggie Kendall Zimmerman. Okay, and she's, I think she was a senior at the University of Illinois, and she did a study, and then her professor, Peter Doran, added his name to it in order to get it to be published in an academic journal. I'm sure she's very proud of having gotten into an academic journal. So what did she do? Now, this is a college paper. So she did a 2-minute online survey of earth scientists working for government agencies and universities. She pulled up the list online. She did this two-question survey, sent it out, and got some responses. All right. She asked the wrong people. So these earth scientists that she was asking. So she leaves out all the solar scientists, all the space scientists, all the cosmologists, physicists, meteorologists, astronomers. I mean, these are the people who probably know something about this issue, right? And they probably know something about natural variability. These are the people who say, okay, the sun probably is influencing climate. And she systematically just leaves them out. Only 5% of the respondents self-identified as being climate scientists. She asked the wrong questions. She says, have temperatures risen? And is human activity a significant contributing factor? Now, on the first one, have temperatures risen? Yes, they have. Joe Bast, the evil denier of global warming, is telling you temperatures rose in the 20th century, second half of the 20th century. Climate is always changing. Nobody denies that, so it's going up and down. Was human activity a significant contributing factor? In science, even the social sciences, we talk about significance. A significant impact can be really tiny, but it's still statistically significant. I think there is a statistically significant impact on climate from human activity. We're emitting billions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and soot and other things that probably are having an impact on climate. We are wiping out forests, we are planting crops, we're irrigating millions of acres of crops, we're creating reservoirs where once there were just desert canyons. You think that doesn't have an impact on climate? I think it does, and it's probably measurable, which means it's statistically significant. So I would answer yes to both of these questions. Most skeptics would answer yes. She asked the wrong questions. And her 98% consensus figure actually refers to the views of only 79 climate scientists. She went through, a larger number responded to her survey, so she went down to only those who self-identify as climate scientists and who are currently publishing. She randomly identifies that little group, and she says, oh my goodness, 98% of them are alarmists. Big surprise. That's not evidence of consensus, okay? It's not good science. It never should have been published. It's just remarkable that a peer-reviewed journal would run something like this. All right, the third paper, the third source cited in NASA's footnote is another college student paper. This one, Stanford University. William R. Love Anderegg does this paper with his professor and a couple of other academics, added their name to his little term paper and got it published. So he claims to have found that 97% of climate researchers most actively publishing in the field, maybe 79 of them again, support the UN IPCC position. He claims that the 50 most prolific alarmists were published an average of 408 times each. 98% of those 50, there we go, it's 50 this time, agree with the IPCC. So NASA, when it says 98% of currently publishing experts, it's talking about 50 scientists in this study, 79 scientists in the other study. I mean, that's fraud, I think. To not put too fine a point on it, isn't that like the definition of fraud? So what's wrong with this study? Well, he used Google Scholar. I have op-ed pieces that come up when you use Google Scholar and you type in Joseph Bast. Op-ed pieces that I wrote come up. So it's not just peer-reviewed journal articles. There's all kinds of stuff that comes up. So a lot of stuff that doesn't come up in Google Scholar. So it's a poor way to collect the database. He also just looked at abstracts because he's not really a scientist. He couldn't read the full articles. He couldn't interpret them. So he just looks at the abstracts. And as we know, abstracts are inaccurate and misleading. Being published less often does not mean a scientist or his or her views are less credible. I think it's an essential point. He just assumes, all these people assume, that if you publish 50 times, you're more credible than a guy who only publishes 5 times. I'll dwell on that maybe in a little more in a minute. Yeah. So the folks who believe global warming is a crisis were being published an average of 408 times. As I say on that slide, that's not evidence of quality. That's evidence of fraud and a broken peer review system. When I was going to college back in the 70s, I had professors, if they could get into a single peer-reviewed journal once a year, that was tenure. And that was the University of Chicago. Thank you. I mean, these were prominent scholars, and they would do 1 or 2 articles a year, and that was considered a big deal. Now you've got academics claiming to be experts on global warming being published an average of 408 times. That happens, it's astonishing, and it happens when you get 50 authors on a single article, and they're increasingly doing that. So now they gang author this stuff. So now every time one article appears, 50 guys add it to their resumes. I think that's fraudulent. And when you put all those guys on your article, how do you get peer review? All the potential peer reviewers are co-authors. Okay, it's pal review is what they call that. So it's evidence of a broken peer review system. And 98% of 50 scientists obviously is not consensus. That's just silliness again. All right, and the fourth footnote that your government agency, your NASA, relies on to make its contention that there's a consensus is the wacky Australian blogger, John Cooke. This guy has a website called skepticalscience.com, where all he does is attack global warming skeptics. The whole purpose of the site is to marginalize and diminish, use ad hominem attacks against global warming skeptics. He's an alarmist. He's done a book on the subject, titled Climate Change Denial, Heads in the Sand. All right, doesn't exactly sound like an objective guy to me. He claims to have found 97% of articles published from 1991 to 2011 endorse the view that human activity is responsible for some warming. Okay, I agree with that. So I guess I'm part of the 97%. He's biased, so we should not trust this guy. It's another abstract counting exercise, just like Naomi Oreskes' effort, so his methodology is fundamentally wrong. Immediately after his article was published, there were tremendous pushback, which is kind of unusual in academic circles. But Legates and several co-authors wrote, they looked at the actual database. They said just 0.3% of these articles endorsed the standard definition of consensus, just 0.3. Richard Toll, who's a very prominent economist in the debate, contributor to the IPCC reports, says the main finding of the paper is incorrect, invalid, and unrepresentative. Christopher Monckton says this project was not a scientific investigation, but a public relations exercise. One of the astonishing things in that study was halfway through the study, they found that too few were being categorized as supporting the consensus. So they changed the definition of what constitutes an endorsement of the consensus to inflate the numbers. I mean, it was just so dishonest, and there's big controversy. If you just Google this, you're going to immediately come upon how they were misrepresenting the data, changed their methodology. It's all just biased advocacy research parading as academic research. All right, so those are the 4 footnotes that NASA uses. Those are the 4 best pieces of research they could find to support their claim of a consensus. Well, I can find a lot better evidence that shows real disagreement among scientists on global warming. And just a few of those things. A medical doctor, Klaus Martin Schulte, did a study using Oreskes' same methodology, but on a more recent selection of articles. He found that the percentage of articles that implicitly or explicitly endorse the consensus has now fallen to 45%, down from 75%. So even using her methodology, he says now fewer than half of the articles are actually supporting what the IPCC says. Dennis Bray and Hans von Storch, they have done maybe 4 or 5 surveys now, international surveys of climate scientists. These are really well done. These are serious surveys that are actually published in peer-reviewed journals when they're released. They asked 54 scientific questions. The most recent one asked 54 questions. How would you rank the data that is used to estimate the effect of warming on cloud formation? How well do we understand cloud formation? How well do we understand the effect on water levels? And how good a job are we doing measuring sea level rise? You know, all stuff like that. And on those questions, about a third of them, the scientists who respond are skeptics. They're saying, I think the evidence is very poor. It's not good enough to support a conclusion. We don't know what's happening with clouds. We don't have decent models that accurately track sea level rise. About a third of them are alarmist, what I call alarmists, that would support the IPCC's position. Oh yeah, we're sure of this. We know that sea level rise is increasing. We know the impact on clouds. And fully a third are right in the middle. So the Bray and von Storch have people rank these things, I think, from like 1 to 7 or 1 to 8. And a third of them are giving it a 3 or a 4. And about a third are giving it a 1 or a 2. And about a third are giving it a 6 or a 7. So, I mean, that's not consensus, right? That's on its face direct evidence of a lot of uncertainty in the scientific community on the basic questions of science that you have to solve if you're going to make predictions about future climate and the impact of human activity on climate. A couple of more pieces of evidence. Verhagen et al., peer-reviewed article, found that fewer than half, about 42% of the people in their survey agreed with the IPCC's claim to be highly confident that more than half of the modern warming is due to human activity. Without getting into the high weeds, you know, we're talking about how confident, what is the statistical probability that we're right, confidence intervals in statistics. And most scientists, they may think that there is a human impact and maybe it's a problem, but they're not confident. They're not willing to put a number on that. They're not willing to say, I'm 96% confident or something like that. The IPCC does. It almost comically says we are 96% confident. This time we're 97% confident. We're getting even more confident. It's not a scientific number. It's not math. It's kind of made up. It's sitting around a table saying, how do we put a number on how strongly we feel about this? You would expect no less from the United Nations. The American Meteorological Society does surveys of its members. Only 52% of its members in a survey done in 2012 believe that the warming of the past 150 years was man-made. That same survey found that only 40% believe that man-made global warming could be dangerous. Far from consensus, and meteorologists know a little bit about climate and weather. Phil Jones, some of you won't recognize the name. Phil Jones is the scientist who has the database of global temperatures. Supposedly, he's the guy, all this data comes in, he massages it, adjusts it, edits it, and then sends it out there. And this becomes the basis for claims that the global temperature has increased or decreased year after year. So he's a really big deal. He became kind of infamous during the ClimateGate scandal when emails were going back and forth. And people were saying, well, show us your data, Phil, freedom of information requests. And he refused, and he blocked, and he refused, and he blocked. Turns out he lost the original data. Original data doesn't exist. All that exists is the massaged, homogenized data, they call it. He has altered this data over and over and over again, and now we just trust Phil that he got it right, and we don't get to look at his data.
The guy from the English University?
Yes, yeah. University of East Anglia. Phil Jones. Phil Jones is his name, yeah. And so the BBC asked him, asked if the scientific debate was over. He replied, I do not believe the vast majority of climate scientists think this. This is not my view. So I think even Phil Jones agrees that there's a lot of debate going on in the scientific community. I'll point to one last piece of evidence about disagreement, and this is my favorite. This is called the Oregon Petition. 31,478 American scientists, including 9,023 with PhDs, signed this petition. It says, in part, there is no convincing scientific evidence that human release of carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases is causing or will in the foreseeable future cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and disruption of Earth's climate. In 2007, Art Robinson, the guy who produced this survey, went back through all the names, reconfirmed them all. The left hates this survey, right? They can't believe it. They mock it. If you go anywhere online, they say it doesn't really exist. And one of the names on there is Pinocchio or, Mickey Mouse. And, Art Robinson checks out Mickey Mouse, and calls him up and says, yeah, unfortunately, that is my name, and I'm a solar physicist, working at such and such a university. Or it was a name that was put in there by an environmental activist to try to discredit the whole list. And there's probably a few of those in there. But the Heartland Institute reprinted the entire directory. We have their names, their specialty, their degree, and the state that they live in. And it's a directory that's, about 300 pages long. So we know they exist. This is a real petition. This is way more scientists willing to put their name on a really explicit statement than anything that comes from the other side, from the alarmist side. They honestly, they can't touch this. Okay, now, the last part of my presentation, I'm gonna end probably in about 10 minutes. So I don't think there's any evidence for consensus. I think there's really strong evidence that there is no consensus, that there's a big scientific debate taking place right now. So why don't scientists agree? It's kind of a natural reaction of people to say, well, they've been studying this for a long time. They spent billions of dollars trying to find an answer. How come they can't come to an agreement? You would think that the smart guys would all get together and agree on one thing. Well, there's 4 reasons why they don't agree. Reason number 1 is that climate is an interdisciplinary subject requiring insights from many different fields of study. Very few scholars have mastery of more than 1 or 2 of these disciplines. So in my experience over the last 20 years, I've been writing and editing and talking to scientists about this now for 20 years. And I will talk to a physicist who says, he knows all about the effect of solar radiation on carbon dioxide molecules in the upper atmosphere and how they vibrate when they get warm and how that creates heat and blah, 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 blah. And he's convinced that he knows all about it. And then I'll talk to a biologist, and the biologist will say, that's the most stupid thing I ever heard. He says that what really controls the climate, these little atoms up there, it's the carbon cycle. And it's all this carbon dioxide being released into the air from the oceans and from plants and then getting sucked back in, and it's these natural cycles. And if you don't understand the carbon cycle, you can't talk about climate. Okay, then he walks out of the room, and then a paleoclimatologist comes in, or a geologist, a paleogeologist like Bob Carter comes in. Bob Carter says climate goes in terms of eons, centuries, thousands of years, millions of years. He says anybody who looks at 20 years or 30 years and says, whoa, that's not natural, is an idiot. And then he'll show all of his slides, all these huge variations over time. Okay, what caused that? There were no SUVs back then, right? And so the archaeologists, the geologists disagree with the physicists who disagree with the biologists. They all disagree with the oceanographers who are convinced that it's ocean currents. Did you know that the big ocean currents have slowed down and that has an impact on climate? Okay, didn't know that. And then some of the physicists know about cloud formation, and others have no idea what's going on with clouds and think that that doesn't matter. And the guys who are experts in clouds say, of course it matters. It reflects solar radiation away from the planet. If it's affecting cloud formation, that's a huge game changer. That makes all the difference in the world. So all these different guys disagree. One reason there is no consensus is because it's a multidisciplinary topic. Different scientists in different disciplines have different insights into it. They will never, frankly, agree on this. Okay. Reason number 2, fundamental uncertainties arise from insufficient observational evidence, disagreements over how to interpret the data, and how to set the parameters of models. Observational evidence. How do we measure the temperature of the whole planet? It's a huge challenge. Until about 30 years ago, most scientists would have said you can't. It's a dynamic system. If it's warming up here, it's cooling down here. An average temperature for a dynamic system arguably doesn't even make sense. But let's say it does make sense, and so they kind of figure it out, and they come up with this new thing. So there's three different ways, at least three ways, to measure temperature. You can measure it using weather balloons that go up into the lower stratosphere, and they have these little devices on them that measure the temperature. And we've got great records of that all around the world. They've been doing this. Like, they put these weather balloons up every day or every week. They collect it. Since 1979, we have satellites, NASA satellites, that can take the temperature readings. And they've been going around the world. That's our first truly global temperature record, because now they got the whole world, not just little parts of it. And the third source is surface-based temperature stations. And you may have come across them over the years. I know University of Chicago, in one of the quads, there was a temperature station. It was a little white box with the slats, so the air can pass through it. And there's a little thermometer in there, and some guy was going in there and checking it and writing it on a piece of paper for many years. And of course, now it's all digital. So those are your three temperature sources for data. Turns out two of those sources agree with each other, and the third one is an outlier. The two that agree are the weather balloons and the satellites. And they are just, if you were to plot it, two lines, they're just like this. I mean, they're just right there together with each other. Surface-based temperature readings go up much higher and don't agree with the satellites and the weather balloons. And we have a pretty good idea why that's the case. It's called the urban heat island effect. Some of these stations, when they were first built, were in the middle of a cornfield. Now they're at the end of a airport landing strip. Literally, many of these stations are at airports, and the airports have gotten a lot bigger. There's a lot of concrete. There's a lot of heat being generated. Concrete absorbs the heat, so you get warmth staying there. Concrete absorbs sunlight and warms up. Heartland has done research over the years that looks at various sightings of these surface temperature stations, and it's astonishing. They locate them on roofs with black roofs of buildings. They've got them in parking lots. They've got them next to what do you do hamburgers on? Barbecue grills. Yeah, the barbecue grill literally right here, and the station is right here. Air conditioning vents right above it. Right in the middle of a parking lot. Cars parked right, 5 feet away from this thing. That's why the surface-based temperature record shows a lot of warming. It's an artifact of what's called the heat island effect. So that's just one example. The computer models we can talk about during Q&A, but it's a great example of garbage in, garbage out. Computer models only reflect what we know or think we know. They can't improve on our knowledge. They just try to capture our knowledge. And they rely on them way too much to try to make predictions in this field. The third reason why scientists disagree is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was created to find a human impact on climate. It's agenda-driven. Its whole mission was to find that impact. So no surprise. You give a group of really smart scientists billions of dollars in 20 years, will they find what you ask them to find? Yeah, they will. So the IPCC, was agenda-driven right from the start. You might just Google Inter-Academy Council audit of the IPCC. The Inter-Academy Council is made up of the heads of all the largest science academies in the world. They did an audit of the IPCC, okay? And what they found was horrific, just horrific. There is no peer review. All the scientists who participate are picked by politicians to support a preconceived point of view. So it's not all the best scientists in the world somehow voluntarily coming together. They're appointed by politicians because of their preconceived ideas about the problem. The lead authors of the chapters get to review their own stuff and decide whether that should be changed. That's not peer review. Okay. And then they produce, my favorite of all for the IPCC's reports, they produce the summary for policymakers. And if you read the newspaper articles, they get together and they hold all-night meetings, and everybody is trying to edit the summary for policymakers. And it's politicians, environmental activists, and a few scientists trying to defend the big study that they just did, okay? But now the politicians and the activists get to write the summary. And they revise it, they drop stuff out. We've got copies of the early drafts of the most recent IPCC report. You can just see what they dropped out and what they put in, and it's all political. It's all aimed at making a more alarmist statement than what the actual science shows. And then most amazing of all, when they finish their summary for policymakers, they go back and edit the full report so that it agrees with the summary for policymakers. I am not kidding you. They literally go back and revise the science to support the politics. So it's not a summary for policymakers, it's a summary by policymakers. And the IPCC isn't a scientific document or organization, it's a political document. And it was created to kind of solve this problem, that we've got this huge multidisciplinary thing. We need one source of authority that we can appeal to, that's objective, that can solve this, end this debate. And they created exactly the wrong organization. They created a Frankenstein thing that doesn't give us the honest, truthful answers to it. All right, and there's one last reason, the fourth reason why scientists disagree. Climate scientists, like all humans, can be biased. The origins of bias include careerism, grant-seeking, political views, and confirmation bias. We've seen all of that. You can get really rich supporting global warming alarmism. Al Gore is a great example of that. In the academy, if you want to get research grants, put global warming in your abstract. Put it in your proposal. There's a huge fund of money that you qualify for if your research addresses global warming, even if it's really just about frogs reproducing in the tropics. So long as there's global warming mentioned in there, you qualify for a grant. So thousands and thousands of scientists have produced thousands and thousands of articles driven by careerism, publish or perish. You got to get that article published, and so you might as well do it on global warming. And confirmation bias, I'll end on that. Confirmation bias is you look at the literature, you look at the evidence in front of you, and you put extra weight on the stuff that agrees with or confirms your pre-existing opinion, okay? And we all do that. Great example, you buy a car and you probably paid too much for it. And it really shouldn't break down within 3 months, but maybe it did. But you're making excuses for your car because you want to confirm the decision that you made when you bought your car. You paid too much for that house, but you love that house. And so even if the broker says it's only worth $200,000, you're sure it's worth $300,000. So that's confirmation bias. In the global warming debate, there is so much literature, so much science, so much stuff going on that you can literally study this issue 8 hours a day for years and only read stuff that agrees with you. Only read stuff that seems to confirm your bias. I've done that, working on these Climate Change Reconsidered volumes. I mean, there's thousands of articles. I just sat there day after day after day reading all these articles that say carbon dioxide actually fertilizes plants and has caused more growth and more food, that it causes less drought. And I'm just reading all these articles. There are articles on the other side, but I don't have time to read all of them. And I literally spent thousands of hours just studying one side of this debate. So I understand how the other side can do the same thing. They can read and read, study and study, and never come across an article that disagrees with them. So that's called confirmation bias. It's a big problem in this debate. So my penultimate slide. So what's wrong with liberals? I was telling people I'm not the brightest light in the chandelier. Okay, I'm just an average guy. I figured this out. I don't understand why liberals haven't figured it out. There's a wonderful book, David Friedman. The title of the book is Wrong: Why Experts Keep Failing Us and How to Know When Not to Trust Them. It's a great book. I highly recommend it to you. It's very entertaining. The guy really nails why experts are so often wrong. And in a chapter on climate change, global warming, this guy is not a conservative. He's not even a skeptic. I mean, he's actually kind of on the other side on this. But he says, many liberals seem constitutionally incapable of giving fair consideration to, or in some cases, even acknowledging expert evidence and arguments, even if in the minority, that question whether we are really in the midst of a man-made global climate crisis. They just can't handle the truth, right? They don't want to open the hood. And I think at the end of the day, that's what this is about. Liberals saw this as a convenient excuse or an opportunity to push ahead with their agenda. They already wanted higher taxes. They already wanted income redistribution. They already wanted windmills and solar panels. They already hate big corporations. They want us to drive little cars. They want us to live in little apartments. Well, golly, global warming justifies all of that. It's a great thing. It was very convenient for the left. And so they never opened the hood. I have yet to debate a global warming alarmist who has actually looked at the science the way that we have. They just assume that it's right. They can't believe that we would take the time to look at the science. And we have a reason to, because we looked at their agenda and said, well, wait a minute. If that's true, you're going to take the country in a bad direction. So we will look under the hood. We will examine the science. And when we did, this is what we found. And now you all know what I have found out about global warming, and you should be able to beat any global warming alarmist in a debate. For more information, first of all, don't trust Google or Wikipedia. Wow. The Heartland Institute has produced, I think the study that I cited earlier said we have published 9 million words on global warming. 9 million words. And if you Google global warming, you might find 1 or 2 mentions of us in the first 20 pages of hits, but that's about it. They have systematically just whitewashed us right out of the Google hits. So don't trust Google to do the research for you. Don't trust Wikipedia. Our Wikipedia page is horrible. They just ignore 90% of what we do and just fill the rest of it with lies. There's 4 really good sites, of course, heartland.org, climatechangereconsidered.org, which is where all of the volumes of the NIPSI report can be found, Craig Idsow's CO2science.org, and Fred Singer's sepp.org. Everything you need to know about global warming you can find on those sites. So thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
If you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll bring over the microphone so people on the live stream can hear us.
Quick comment.
Oh, and please identify yourself so that Joe knows who is he speaking to.
I'm Larry Greenberg. The quick comment is I teach students from all over the world. They're learning English. So out of the 100 some odd I've had in the last year, all of whom are highly educated, almost none of them is a skeptic or even uncertain. The propaganda effort around the world is, whether they're from the Middle East, the Far East, Eastern Europe, which is where I have most of my students, ex-communist countries or countries where they're too young to know about communism, this is the religion.
It's a scary thing, yeah, and I hear everybody saying yes. Diane and I don't have any kids, but we have lots and lots of nieces and nephews and great nieces and great nephews, and they're getting to watch An Inconvenient Truth twice a week. It's in English class, it's in science class, it's in human affairs, whatever all these other courses are. So it is heavy-handed propaganda going on in K-12 schools, and it's hard to reverse that. We can talk a little bit about efforts in that direction, but it's really tough to get into public schools for sure, but private schools are all just aping the public schools now. They have the same curriculum, the same tests that their kids have to take, and so it's as bad or even worse in a lot of the charter schools. So it's tough. Yes, sir.
Kevin Callahan, you began to touch on motivations at the end. The question I have is, to what extent do you believe that some of the motivation for this is to affect the transfer of a large amount of wealth from the first world to the third?
I think that plays a big role in the motivation of some of the people in this debate. We get asked that a lot, and we ponder this a lot. If I can figure out the science, why can't they? If they are deliberately ignoring the science, what is their motive? Why would they do that? And you can quickly start to speculate about people's motives, and it's generally not a good idea to do that. And so we try not to. George Soros and who's the fellow who just recently passed away? The founder, Maurice Strong. Yeah, Maurice Strong started the environmental program at the United Nations. The environmental program created the IPCC. Maurice Strong was very clear. His goal was to create a justification for the United Nations to have its own taxing authority and to become a more powerful entity in world affairs. Yeah, and I'm not a conspiracy nut. This guy said it, wrote it. It's part of the mission. You look at all the organizing documents. I mean, that was his plan. That was certainly his motive for getting us going in this direction. Now, there's a lot of scientists who aren't liberals, who aren't socialists, who believe in global warming. So I respect that. So it's not the motive of everybody, but that is the motive of some. And people in politics especially, I think, because they're not scientists, because they haven't looked at the science, they don't care about the science. For them, it's about power. Global warming is a great excuse for power. You can justify all sorts of laws, increase the size and cost of government by appealing to global warming. I think that's a big part of their motivation. Yes, sir.
Hi, Will Bauer. Just a comment that when you're talking about the IPCC and thinking that they're this group of experts that really have knowledge in this particular field, it's interesting to point out that the head of the IPCC for the majority of this effort was a gentleman whose technical background is as a railroad engineer. And that qualifies him on this multidisciplinary problem.
I guess it gave him, yeah, he certainly wasn't hung up on the science. Yeah, and of course he was also a novelist. So he wrote a pornographic novel. And he's just been arrested. He's been in the news just in the last few days, yeah, for sexual harassment. He's a real piece of work. And that's the head of the IPCC for, I don't know, 10 years, 15 years? Yes, sir.
Well, first we have a question from online. It's about carbon taxes or CO2 taxes. Do we know of any organizations, perhaps the Heartland Institute, is doing anything besides informing the public about the impact a carbon tax or CO2 tax would have, whether it's imposed in the United States or globally?
Yeah, the Heartland Institute is strongly opposed to a carbon tax. So we think it's absolutely unnecessary. This goes to motives as well. I mean, I think a lot of the reason for advocacy for global warming is just to get a carbon tax. And the minute they get their carbon tax, they'll stop talking about global warming and they'll just enjoy the money. The whole purpose was to get the money. Yeah. So we're against that. We think it's unnecessary, counterproductive. It hurts the poor. It's regressive. But most of all, it's just unnecessary. It's a bad thing to do. The Tax Foundation, Competitive Enterprise Institute, Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, they're all against a carbon tax, and for that same reason. I know Heritage has done some really good economic modeling that estimates the cost per household of a carbon tax. And finally, they talk about a carbon tax, but they have a backdoor approach to implementing global warming policy, and that's renewable energy mandates. So they pass these laws. I'm going to forget the exact numbers here. Tim, you might know what the mandate in Illinois is.
25%.
Is it 25%?
I believe by next year. Possible.
There we go. 25% of all the electricity sold in Illinois has to be sourced from renewable power sources. And that doesn't include nuclear power. We're not going to count nuclear. Yeah, just hypocrisy on the other side again. So this is hugely expensive. Wind and solar are very expensive. And we've got an expert on it here who's going to help us out on it.
Another interesting fact is that the EPA projections for their power plan for clean power assume that all these laws that exist are actually going to come to fruition. So the EPA's plan for regenerable and renewables already takes into account that Illinois is going to have 25%, which there's not a snowball's chance, and in Arlington Heights today.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. And it's politicians making promises that they can't keep. And it's real easy to make a promise and to say in 10 years, in 20 years, in 30 years, they're not going to be in office then. People are going to forget the promises that they made. And the increase in your electricity bill, yeah, except in Illinois, unless you're Speaker of the House. Michael Madigan was Speaker of the House when the Heartland Institute was started 32 years ago. And he is still in that position, so it's an astonishing thing. But the increased cost of energy is in your electric bill, and it gets passed through in the price of the products that you buy and the gasoline that you buy. And so you don't know who to blame, and you don't think it's the politicians. You don't think that it's because solar is more expensive or wind is more expensive. There isn't something on your bill that breaks it out and explains it. So that's the invisible tax. The carbon tax is just one way to tax us to support this boondoggle. The energy mandates, renewable energy mandates, is the other.
Yeah, Joe? David Peerenboom. A few years ago, I read Senator Inhofe's book, The Greatest Hoax, and he focused a lot on the whole Climate Gate scandal that fortunately was exposed. And I'm just wondering if you have much comment on what you know about that. In particular, when you were talking about this, one scientist before, I think he was one of the ones that was very much involved, and I don't remember his name.
Yeah, Phil Jones. Yeah.
Oh, Phil Jones?
Yeah. Yeah, and Michael Mann. You might
Michael
be thinking
Mann
of
was the guy,
Michael
I think.
Mann was deeply involved, yeah.
I'm just wondering what your comment was on his Senator Inhofe's work on that.
Well, I think it's an excellent book, and Senator Inhofe is really to be given a lot of credit. A really brave guy, virtually a lone voice for many years, and now gradually the rest of the Republicans have come over to his side. But for a long time, he was the only one who had the courage to say this. ClimateGate was, the release of a whole batch of emails showing that there was conspiracy isn't too harsh a word for this. It was a conspiracy among scientists to keep skeptics out of the published literature, out of the peer-reviewed literature. They would literally be talking to editors saying, don't publish that guy, Pat Michaels. Oh, no, we're not going to publish him. And it's a great piece of research. And Pat Michaels is one of the most respected climatologists in the world. And he has this great academic record. All of a sudden, all of his articles are getting rejected. And it's because the guys who are doing the peer review were trading all these emails back and forth. Let's stop that. Let's stop him. Let's threaten this editor with being fired if he or she publishes this article. Real misbehavior. And then frank admissions among themselves. We got to hide the decline, the famous line, hide the decline, because one of the temperature records that they were using that they claimed showed temperatures all of a sudden going up like this. Well, no, actually it went like this. So they said, well, all we have to do is snip that part of the graph off and you just don't see it. And indeed, you look at the IPCC report and that line goes up and then it stops. You say, what happened to that line? Well, there's other lines that go up. They literally truncated the database because it disagreed with the message that they were trying to create. And they knew what they were doing. The emails revealed that. So nobody went to jail for that. Nobody lost a position in a university for that. Yeah. The statute of limitations, is that what it's called, ran out before they could put somebody in jail for illegally obstructing a FOIA request, because they broke the law by refusing to share that data, but they held out long enough so that they ended up not having to go to jail. And the universities did their own investigations, whitewashed it all, said nothing to see here, folks, keep going. Just outrageous. And the press in the United States, I'm just about done, the press in the United States just ignores it. There's no stories at all. In Europe, it was front page news, day after day after day. In the United States, it's like a weekend story and it's gone and don't pay any attention to it. That's horrible.
All right, we have another question from our viewers online, Joe. Why cannot a case be mounted in the courts against anthropogenic global warming that would expose the material you have assembled? That's from Owen Jennings.
I don't think the courts are the right place for this to be resolved. That was attempted once before. Kind of in the early days of this, there was litigation by coal companies on attempts to reduce the use of coal in the name of global warming. They had a whole bunch of guys, Pat Michaels and various other scientists who are still active in the debate, testify. You look at the testimony that was submitted, I think the skeptics clearly won. I think we had all the good data, all the science, but the judge kind of looked it all over and said, these guys win. And it was over. So, you know, judges are no more qualified than the rest of us to have an informed opinion on this thing. And I wouldn't trust a judge to determine the scientific truth of a statement or a hypothesis.
Intellectual dishonesty is protected by the First Amendment.
It is. And this, if you don't mind, pause. So intellectual dishonesty is protected by the First Amendment. What we have found is the news media can say anything about us. And we say, you know, oh, they say, you know, it's funded by the Kochs. It's been 16 years since we got anything from the Kochs, and they never gave us much. And I mean, that was before we even got involved in the global warming debate. They're funded by Exxon. You know, it's been, I don't know, about 15 years. I'm going to get those exact numbers wrong, but it's on our website. They haven't funded us since before we really got involved in the global warming debate. And yet, mainstream media will put that in there over and over again. We say, well, obviously you're doing that to hurt our reputation, to make it sound like we were paid by Exxon to release this report, when you know that they haven't funded us in 15 years. Exxon reports every gift it gives in its annual reports. Why isn't that defamation? Isn't that libel? Isn't that a deliberate effort to discredit us? And the lawyers say, Joe, don't even try. Says you could spend hundreds of thousands of dollars, years. The best you're going to get is a retraction on page 12. And while you're fighting this, 100 other newspapers are going to repeat that same lie. What are you going to do? Sue every one of them? You can't. And then when we go to our Wikipedia page, what are they citing? They're citing that LA Times story that lied about us. And we say, well, that article was not accurate. And they say, well, it's mainstream media. It's the LA Times. If it was inaccurate, you should have protested when it was published. And we say, well, we did complain, but they ignored us. Well, sorry. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Hi, I'm John DeLeo. Thank you so much. Well done. I can't say enough how grateful we are for what Heartland has done on this issue. There's one aspect of it that I don't know if we talk about enough, and I'm wondering if you would comment, because this is more on the economic side of the issue. What if they're sort of right? That is, what if they're right that there is really a little more global warming that could theoretically cause some of the things that they claim it might, such as the water's rising in a couple of coastal towns, making it dangerous for those towns. I always look at situations like Galveston 100 years ago, where something that man did not cause, an earthquake, caused the city to be in bad shape, and so they used funds, money, to be able to shore it up. Well, shouldn't we focus at least somewhat on the point that what they are advocating would so damage the economy that we couldn't afford to do the measures necessary when things really do happen? When a city is flooded, when a city is in trouble, their programs make it impossible for us to fund the things that we need to do. Any thoughts?
Yeah, you put it really well, and you're absolutely right. This is building resiliency to climate change, whether the climate change is natural or man-made. Why aren't we investing in that? So make the dikes higher, put power lines underground so that if there is an increase in severe weather, we don't have power outages. And in various ways, harden the infrastructure is the language that's used in the literature. We spend almost nothing on that. We spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year trying to reduce emissions, subsidizing renewable fuels. And a fraction of that spent on dikes would make a much bigger difference, would actually save lives. One of the big problems in natural disasters, which could be caused maybe by global warming 50 years from now, 100 years from now, is water supplies immediately get polluted. And people die from bad water in crises. It's hard to get clean water, safe water in a natural emergency. So harden the water supply, build pipes, build better roads that you can transport tankers of water in case of a natural emergency. And we're not doing that. Instead we're fixated on reducing emissions, not building resilience. And this gets to motive again. If I really cared about global warming, if I'm a liberal and I'm really worried that people are going to be hurt by major storms and surges and stuff in the future, I would be advocating investing in resilience. And Bjorn Lomborg, he's a good economist, he compares the cost, okay, so it's going to cost us $1 million to save one life if we focus on reducing emissions in order to get rid of 0.001 degree warming 100 years from now. And if instead we spent that same money on DDT to get rid of malaria, we would save 1 million lives. So you got to compare the cost of trying to protect people by mitigating emissions to protecting people by strengthening infrastructure or other public health initiatives. And when you do that, it immediately becomes obvious that global warming isn't about protecting human health at all. It's about raising money for governments. I don't know, it's about political campaigns. It's about a lot of things, but it's not about protecting the health and safety of people, either today or into the future.
Liz, thank you, Joe. Despite billions being spent on the global warming initiative around the world, the people, certainly in the United States, do not consider global warming a threat. It's way down in the level of concerns from the public. I'd like you to address a little bit this push for, on all different levels, in grammar schools and elsewhere in the school system, really now pushing global warming to our children, and now with the Vatican and the encyclical, also they now have a new moral voice behind the global warming initiative.
Well, yeah, we touched on this a little bit earlier. So there is a full frontal attack, I think, on American kids to try to propagandize them on this issue. And I think it's unethical. I think it's just a horrible thing. I think for teachers to be scaring kids by showing them pictures of glaciers melting. Glaciers melt naturally. I'm sorry. It happens all the time. It's called winter and spring, and deserts and dead animals. I mean, they're frightening kids. They're using fear. Educators should not use fear. Geez, I mean, I would think that would be just rule number one. And when they see that in Al Gore's documentary film, that should just be a huge red flag. They should say, I'm not going to show that in my classroom. That's unfair. Images are really powerful. What we try to do when we educate kids is we wean them off of images, image-based thinking. We try to get them to read, because reading is linear, it's multi-step, it forces you to think. And if you just react to images instead of responding to signals, I think is the distinction in the literature, then you can actually get a rational thought process. So they're using scare tactics. I think it's absolutely unethical. We need to get some balance in the classrooms. I'm a little optimistic that this is going to happen. I think the American people are fed up with this. Surveys show about half of us think this is all nonsense. 40% think the media is exaggerating the problem. These are big numbers, and the people who pay attention almost immediately figure it out, because they don't have to be real bright to see through what the other side is doing on this issue. So if the temperatures continue to stay relatively flat, we're now going into the 19th year where temperatures have not risen, pretty well flat for 19 years. If that continues for a few more years, or if we go into a global cooling period, I think the wheels fall off of this thing. At some point, people are going to say, you're an idiot. You say there's global warming, well, look out the window. I mean, for heaven's sakes, it's March and there's snow on the ground. This is not global warming. So I'm hopeful that that's going to happen. And maybe with a different president, any president besides Barack Obama, who has made this issue oddly kind of one of his legacy things. Once we're past Barack Obama, it's got to go in our direction. Public interest is going to go down, and investment in this stuff is going to go down, and more people are going to realize this was just a really terrible mistake that we made.
Joe, I have to tell you, I have a nephew who is a freshman in high school in Pittsburgh, and he asked me the other day whether this video was going to be available after you were done with the live stream. And I said, well, yeah, everything is automatically archived on the YouTube page. I'll be sure to send you the link. He's going to back up, in his science class, his teacher asked, who here doesn't believe in global warming? To my nephew's credit, he put his hand up, and he was the only one. And so he's asked if he could get that link, and he's going to ask his teacher if they can show that in class. So Al Gore, 4,020,020, Joe Bast, 1. You know, you start small, but I'm proud of my nephew, and I'll keep you updated on whether they get to show at least some of this in his class. And we have a question over here. Unless you wanted to comment on that while I walk.
Good luck to him.
Hey, Joe. Peter Meister.
Hey, Peter.
I was wondering if you can maybe give an update on the latest outcome of Paris. When I was trying to follow it right after the event, there was a lot of hype, and I read where it was just hype because all the agreements were voluntary and there was no teeth in it. But just recently I saw something, I don't remember, I didn't read the whole thing, where Obama's going to, I don't know if he's doing executive actions again, that has some teeth in it, and I think the Republicans, or the advice to the Republicans was that they need to say, no, this is actually a treaty and we need to be able to vote on it so we can vote it down.
Yeah, that was a very good summary of what's going on. So in the lead up to Paris, we were told repeatedly this was the last chance to get a binding treaty. That, and for a number of reasons, they think that temperatures are going to go out of control if we don't do something right away. So they have this pseudo-scientific theory that justifies that we needed to do something right away before it's too late. But they're also looking at demographic trends and fiscal trends in countries around the world. And they realize with the entitlement crisis that's coming in all these countries, you know, an aging population, very low population growth rates, low economic growth rates, that the money just isn't there to make these kinds of investments in renewable energy or to redistribute income to developing countries. So this was their last chance to get a binding agreement, both to cap emissions and to transfer money to third world countries. And they did not get it. They did not. They got a toothless agreement. Nothing is binding, no obligations. All it is these optimistic commitments made by politicians that supposedly are going to take place long after they're out of office. So that's good news for us. We won big time in Paris. And then at the domestic level, the Obama administration's way to meet its commitment in Paris was the Clean Power Plan. And the Supreme Court put a stay on that plan just days before Justice Scalia passed away. That's huge, because that means that plan cannot go into effect until we have a new president of the United States. Now, Obama is going to try to do some things through executive orders. There's going to be litigation. They're going to try to stop it. A lot of this stuff takes a long time. I don't think he's going to get anything done before he leaves office, anything new on this topic before he leaves office. So that's another huge victory. At the domestic level, at the federal level, we will not be implementing carbon dioxide caps in the United States. Now, if Hillary Clinton gets elected or Bernie Sanders gets elected, they will attempt to reestablish this once again through executive order and through regulations. But even then, I don't think Congress is going to allow that to go through. If the courts continue to stay on it, he's got to get congressional approval for different legislation. He's not going to get that.
Towards that end, Joe, it's interesting to note that even the Clean Power Plan issued by EPA says that it will do nothing to abate or avert climate change warming.
Exactly right. Yep.
So this plan that's going to cost us all our power bills going up 4 to 5 times eventually is going to do absolutely nothing. They admit it up front, yet they're still trying to do it, which is the definition of insanity in my book.
Or we just don't know their motives. Well, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you do go back to that because, yeah, it's going to have virtually no detectable impact, even using their own science. And the reason is developing countries' emissions are going up, ours are actually going down. China now has more emissions than we do. The more we try to reduce our emissions, the more manufacturing goes into other countries. So they're still going to manufacture stuff, so they release the carbon dioxide instead of us. It's called leakage. So we try to tamp it down here, and it just increases over there. And so we're on a downward trend in our emissions of carbon dioxide. That'll continue just because we get more and more efficient all the time. We're electrifying our economy, things like that, demographics. But the rest of the world is increasing it. And we could go to zero on our emissions. We could go right back to living in caves and have no cars and no air conditioning and no furnaces, and it would be 0.05 degrees 100 years from now. That's the only impact. So how does the other side justify this? They justify it by saying, well, we got to lead by example. If we do this, other countries will do it. Okay? And if lots of countries do it, then add up all these little efforts and you actually get an impact on climate. And it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And that's where Paris comes in again. The treaty doesn't bind anybody else to do anything. The Kyoto Protocol at least did have binding caps on the countries that signed it. We don't even have that anymore. So there is no obligation. Not on developed countries, not on developing countries. They're not going to reduce their emissions.
All right, we have time for one last question.
As just a quick comment, has anybody thought to suggest to the president that maybe when it comes to global warming, we could lead from behind in that area too?
Very good. I can't improve on that. Well done. Thank you very much. I think we're finished here.
Joe Bast gets a signed copy of the book.
I'm happy to do that. All right, and Jim, you're going to turn this. You're going to turn off the live feeds. Yes.
No need to rush. There's no need to run out of here, but for the evening, I'm sure you have a chance.
That's right. The doors are not locked, so you should feel free.
What kind of usage do we have on the live stream?
About 100 at any given time. I mean, at the peak, I think it's about 100, and then coming in and out. So we'll get the stats on that tomorrow morning.
That's really good. Well, whether we had the last